I'm David Sproles, president of the New York School of Interior Design, and I'm excited to welcome you to Teaching Green, NYSID's first symposium on sustainability in interior design education. If you're here at Teaching Green, you already understand that humanity is facing an existential crisis in climate change. You know that the interior design profession is overdue in reckoning with its role in worldwide carbon emissions, 40% of which are caused by the building industry. I want to thank Avi Rajagopal, who you'll hear from this evening, along with Andrew Revkin, for sounding the alarm for our industry in December of 2020 in his article in Metropolis magazine. Until recently, there was a dearth of dialogue on the contribution of interiors to carbon emissions, waste, and pollution. Commercial interiors are typically renovated every 5 to 10 years. Those materials and furnishings, all that energy that goes into those interiors, usually winds up as landfill. The interior design industry is a big part of the problem, which means interior designers can be powerful change agents. And it starts with education. We need to teach our clients to think of interiors as assets that might have a long-term life instead of just being disposable. We must use data to show clients the impact the materials they select will have on human health, ecosystems, and the climate. We must introduce the concepts of reuse and disassembly into every presentation. Now, NYSID has been pushing sustainability into the mainstream of interior design education for over a decade now. Our philosophy of teaching interior design is that the discipline should enhance human health, happiness, and productivity, and solve problems in people's lives. There's no larger problem threatening humanity than the degradation of our planet. NYSID's Master of Professional Studies in Sustainable Interior Environments is in its 11th year, entering its second decade. Sustainability isn't a sidebar at NYSID. This college requires every student in the BFA and MFA programs to take a class titled Introduction to Sustainable Design. In addition, we weave sustainability into every class and studio. What we've learned in our years as a single discipline college at the forefront of sustainable interior design education is that there is often a generational gap in knowledge about sustainable design. More than half of the students in NYSID's MFA and BFA programs center their theses on sustainability. The younger generations are anxious about the terrible burden they have inherited. They are focused on designing solutions. Yet, many master practitioners and instructors of interior design have an insufficient framework on sustainable design practices, because historically, it was not part of the business. We designed the symposium to create a circular dialogue between students, instructors, and practitioners to fill those gaps. We opened it up to educational institutions all over the country because this issue is so much bigger than NYSID. We brought some of the nation's foremost experts on sustainable design to the table this weekend to help make you a thought leader in sustainable interior design. Now, this symposium would not be possible without the support and vision of our funders and industry partners. Teaching Green was underwritten by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. The generosity of like-minded partners brought many of these exceptional speakers to our virtual and actual stages this weekend. Thank you to Benjamin Moore, Perkins & Will, Sandow Design Group, Material Bank, Plywood, Robin Brady Architectural Materials, MEBL Transforming Furniture, Aniad Architects, Design for Health by Mindfulness, and the New York chapter of the IIDA for their support of Teaching Green. I'm also grateful to Barbara Weinreich, NYSID's Interim Director of Graduate Studies, and David Bergman, the Director of NYSID's Master of Professional Studies in Sustainable Interior Environments, for curating and organizing this outstanding program. It's our hope you'll share what you've learned at Teaching Green with others. The window for action on carbon emissions is closing. If we want to sustain a habitable world for our children and grandchildren, we must make a difference now and implement changes in our industry. We have to. So, welcome to the symposium and enjoy. I'd like to now pass the screen over to NYSID Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Ellen Fisher, who will introduce tonight's speakers. Thank you.
I'm Ellen Fisher, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean at New York School of Interior Design. I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Editor-in-Chief of Metropolis Magazine, Avi Rajagopal. Avi is and has been a leading voice for sustainability within the professions of the built environment, interior design, architecture, landscape design, and product design, advocating in myriad ways for a better world. With an MFA in design criticism from the School of Visual Arts and a background in product design, Avi's work at Metropolis has moved the needle. At this year's NeoCon, Avi launched the new Interior Design Pledge for Positive Impact with the American Society of Interior Designers, the International Interior Design Association, and the Interior Designers of Canada. They propose the comprehensive framework for sustainable, healthy, and just interior design, asking design professionals to commit to designing for climate, health, and equity. We should all sign this. Through his words and actions, Avi is a change maker, and we are thrilled to have him as our opening keynote. In conversation with Avi is Andrew Revkin. What an honor to have you with us today. A graduate of Brown University, Andrew holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and was awarded an honorary doctorate in 2009 from PACE in humanistic studies. His career has married science with writing, his two passions, bringing together communications and environmentalism. After many years as a journalist at the New York Times and author of the .Earth blog, Andrew became a strategic advisor for environmental and science journalism for the National Geographic Society. In July 2019, he became the founding director of the Earth Institute's Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University. In his every endeavor over many years, Andrew Revkin has worked across disciplines to communicate the challenges of climate change and to support innovative thinking and action to manage the challenges facing our planet. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you to Avi and Andrew for being with us at Teaching Green, the symposium on teaching sustainable interior design at New York School of Interior Design.
Before I begin my presentation, I just want to say that, last year Metropolis also launched a special student-oriented program called Future 100, where we were searching for some of the best and brightest architecture and interior design graduates from across North America. And one of my favorite things about what we found about what's happening in classrooms is what David spoke about, that interest in taking on the mission of fighting climate change, of fighting inequity, of really finding a professional stance to addressing some of the larger problems in our society and in our world. So I'm really glad that some of the work that we're doing, and hopefully that all of you are doing, is going to help these students make an impact in the world and make the impact that they want to. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I think we all agree. We're in this room because hopefully we all believe in that, but that we all need to fight climate change. And yes, interior designers too, even though that has not always been clear. Obviously, what we do in the building sector puts greenhouse gases in the air. Now, I know I don't need to go over those numbers with you, but I just want to point out that, we are in far excess, right, of the greenhouse gases that we can take, and that our natural systems, which are simultaneously being degraded, can absorb back into the carbon cycle. So while we talk today about reducing carbon emissions and getting to net zero or carbon neutral, I just want you to remember, just hold in your heads, that this is not necessarily an act of removal or reduction alone. That eventually we're going to have to address this historic wrong, right? Several hundred years of imbalance in the way that we have done things in the building industry. And most of you are familiar with this figure, David brought it up as well, that the building industry accounts for about 39% of the world's carbon emissions. Now, the good news is that in the United States, the United States carbon emissions in general and the building industry's carbon emissions in particular have come down. However, in proportion, the proportion has stayed quite the same. So, in a way, you might read into it and say that we're doing about as well as all other industries and about as badly as all other industries, okay? And so that proportion hasn't really changed since Metropolis first published this figure in 2003. Some of you might remember that issue that said architects pollute on the cover. That was Ed Mazria's work, and huge credit, of course, due to him and Architecture 2030. I want you to note one thing, though, that the 11% that's attributed to building materials and construction here says core and shell. So, of course, immediately the question arises, where is the years in this figure, okay? In order to understand the role of interior design in the broader carbon emissions problem, we have to understand two things fundamentally, right? One of them is embodied carbon, and I assume that a lot of you who are listening to us today, watching this, a lot of you here in the room are familiar with what embodied carbon is. Embodied carbon is all the emissions that we put in the air when we make stuff, ship it to our project sites, install it, maintain it, dispose of it, right? And so currently, embodied carbon represents about a quarter of the building industry's carbon emissions, okay? The rest of it is building operations. So to put it another way, about 3/4 of buildings' emissions are based off of, what you can see on your utility bill, for instance, right? What happens when you turn on the lights in a building, the energy that you use, that you need in order to have the lights come on, right? But then there's all the energy that's already gone into pulling metal out of the earth, turning it into sheets, turning that into lamps, bringing that to your site, installing it. Even a single wire has 3 or 4 materials in it, and unfortunately one of them is PVC. So, every single component of buildings and every single component of interiors already has emitted a huge amount of greenhouse gases before it ever gets to your site, right? And then we think about, okay, what's going to happen when this project is done? And the products in it, the materials in it have reached their useful life. So this is bad enough news already. But the worst news, and this is, I hate to put it in these terms, is that buildings are actually getting more efficient in terms of the energy they use to run. So because we're moving towards green grids, and there's been some enormous progress in recent years around that, buildings are getting more efficient to run, which is bad news for us in this room and in this industry, because we're not getting more efficient at the same time. So what happens is that Architecture 2030 projects that for new construction, and I'm pointing that out because I'm sure some of you who are working in the sustainability field, that should put some antenna up for you. But for new construction, if we continue business as usual, that 28% piece is eventually going to end up by 2050 being about 51%. So about half of all the building industry's emissions will be embodied carbon, okay? And embodied carbon is, of course, one of the pieces that we control pretty heavily in the interior design industry, and I'll show you why. For that, you have to understand the second thing, which is life cycles. Now, I'm sure there's some of you who've trained as architects. I'm sure you have very good friends who are architects, so no shade on any of them. But we made a pretty big oversight when we calculated the carbon footprint of the building industry, is that we assume, as architects generally tend to do, that you put a building up, and then the building pretty much remains the same. It's just, the lights are turned on and turned off every day, the HVAC is on all day, all of that stuff for the rest of its life, and then at some point the building is torn down, right? So when you do a life cycle assessment of a building project, you're essentially calculating over that narrative, that story. But we in this room know that our profession, the interior design profession, doesn't really run on new construction. Anywhere between 60 to 95% of some interior design firms' practices are renovation projects, tenant improvement projects. As David said, in most cases, even now, the calculations we're making are based on interiors being renovated every 10 years. And we know that, in most healthcare spaces, for instance, every finish is turned over every 10 years. Facilities managers kind of have that as a mandate. We used to assume that workplaces were 10 years, but when is the last time you heard of a 10-year lease on a workplace? Leases are getting shorter and shorter. Every time a tenant moves in and a tenant moves out and another tenant moves in, usually the owners strip it to white, strip the entire interior down, turn the surface, all the surfaces white, right? And then bring the new tenant in to show them the space. So already we've thrown so much stuff out. We've already, caused this huge carbon crime essentially every time, right? Recently, I was talking to the workplace teams and real estate teams at tech firms, and when I said, every 5 years we're changing our interiors, one of them sheepishly put their hand up and did this. Okay, so the problem is getting more acute as we speak. Okay, so how do we? But what does that add up to? What does that add up to? Well, in 2019, the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is an academic association cited at the University of Washington, did a study on tenant improvement projects, and they found that the carbon footprint of those repeated tenant improvements is very large. Okay, so they built a calculator to help folks calculate the carbon footprint of those tenant improvements. And then we had Element Architects out of Seattle apply that calculator to their own office, a project they know very well. And so you can see the numbers here, and we published this in Metropolis in our November-December 2020 issue. Element Architects moved into their building, into their floor, somewhere in the early 1980s. Okay, they knew that they were not moving into a space that looked like it had been put there in the 60s, so they knew that at least one renovation had happened since the building was built in the 60s. Okay, and then they knew the renovations they had undertaken in their space, so they put in numbers for all of those. And you can see what they found. I mean, it's pretty clear. Over the life of their building to date, the embodied carbon footprint of interiors is equal to that of the embodied carbon footprint of the structure and the envelope of the building. And remember, the building hasn't been torn down yet. That means by the end of this building's life, it's going to be renovated a few times more. And Element Architects, after we published this last year, they went back and redid their numbers, and they found that actually right now, it's a 50-50. 50% of the embodied carbon footprint of their space is interior renovations. I have some worse news. The numbers that they used to calculate the embodied carbon footprint of their interiors were global warming potential numbers for each of the products and materials from today. So they assumed a certain number of chairs were in the office in 1960, but they used today's chairs to calculate that carbon footprint because they don't have numbers from 1960. Which means that, hopefully things have gotten more efficient since the 60s. So likely the footprint for those earlier renovations is even larger than what they've calculated, right? So notionally, directionally, this is a conservative figure, and notionally we know that the problem is actually probably even larger than this, okay? But there's still a lot of calculation that needs to be done, but this is where we are. Let's add that up to that 39% number, okay? I have to put a caveat here. Most of the numbers that we've looked at from Architecture 2030 and other sources are based on new construction, okay? It is not clear if that construction activity includes tenant improvement projects, but we're going to assume that it does, okay? If it doesn't, then that number is going to be even bigger than the one you see on screen. But follow along, 39% of the world's carbon emissions is the building sector. About half of that by 2050 is going to be embodied carbon emissions, so that brings us to a 19% number. And 51% is embodied carbon, so it brings us to a 19% number. And then if half of that conservatively is interior design, that means by 2050, if we don't do anything today, interior design is going to have influence about over 1/10 of the world's carbon emissions. That is a big number sitting on all our shoulders here, okay? And the good thing is that there are things that we can do. So what can we do? Before we jump right into what we can do, I just want to point out a couple of things that are structurally different about the interior design profession as compared to architecture. Because architecture, of course, Architecture 2030 was founded in 2004. They've had a number of years to build tools and build calculators and all those things to address their carbon footprint. But we are structurally different in the interior design industry, and we have to understand that about ourselves. Interior design is a relay race. Because most of the projects that your students are going to touch are going to be renovation projects, that's just the fact of the industry today. That means that almost any project you touch, another interior designer has touched it before you, and you have to design it as though another interior designer is going to touch it again 10 years from now or 5 years from now. If we don't accept that basic fact, we're going to be, designing ourselves to extinction. I was at NeoCon this past week, and I met many product designers, and one of them was talking to me about the materials in the chair that he had designed, and I said, okay, that's a good idea for end of life when this chair ends up in the landfill. And he looked at me quite seriously and said, well, I hope it never ends up in the landfill. And I was flabbergasted. We cannot design for some utopia where our spaces live forever. We have to accept the fact that spaces are going to be turned over till the very systems and structure of this profession change. And that's something we have to work on simultaneously. But in the interim, if we continue to design as though our designs are going to live forever, we're doing a huge disservice to the planet. Okay, so there is a way that we can allow room for the fact that the products we design or that the products that we're using will hopefully have a second life and a third life and a fourth life. And yet we should be designing as though they're not. And that's the assumption we have to make, because that's the truth. Less than 5% of all carpet in this country gets recycled. And carpet is the one industry that has actual processes in place for bringing product back and recycling. And that industry is at 5%. So I'll leave it to you what assumptions you should make. The second thing that David pointed out is that interior design touches lives. So if an architect were to change out the concrete that he's using in the foundations of a building to carbon pure cement, as many architects are doing now in order to bring down the embodied carbon of that concrete of the building, you wouldn't really know walking into the building. But if you change out the floors, the walls, the lighting, the furniture, you can bet anybody walking into that space is going to know, right? And so we have this direct interface with the human experience. And I'm not saying that architects don't, but we do have, there's nothing that we do that does not have a direct interface with the human experience. So we have to design for that. So at Metropolis, we wanted to create a place for us to start grappling with this problem, acknowledging there are many gaps in knowledge still. What we created is the Climate Toolkit for Interior Design. It's available at that link. It's free, it's open, it's written so anybody can use it. We worked with all these organizations to create the Climate Toolkit. It was a several-month process. And as you can see, we tried to bring together people from across the interiors industry. We worked in 5 different working groups, even though this is not the final structure of the toolkit. I just want to show you the kinds of things we were thinking about. Is how do we build a business case for low carbon interiors? How do we talk to clients about it, right? How do we work with contractors? How do we work with vendors? How do we work with all other stakeholders on projects to lower the carbon footprint of our work? And the last one, really important, how does interior design itself need to change? Again, as I said, if we think that we can continue business as usual and achieve different results, somebody once said that's the definition of insanity. I'm not quite sure, because as any educator knows, doing things over and over sometimes can help you get better at them. But, we have to structurally change the way we do things, right? Without that, we're not going to be able to move the needle. So this is how the toolkit is structured. It's structured to help you work with clients, to change your practice at a firm level or broadly, and then what you can do on your next project. It also has tons of resources and tools. And one aspect that I'm particularly proud about, where there is a gap in knowledge, the toolkit admits it. So, for instance, we ask you to calculate the carbon footprint of your projects using a certain process. But at the same time, we tell you, unfortunately, some pieces of data for certain product categories are just not available today. So you're going to have to find ways to work around that. Which means that there's so many research and creative opportunities available in this work for all of you, educators, and also for all of your students, right? There's so much to be done. The toolkit is a living resource, and I think this is really important because information is changing all the time. I know of certain resources that are going to be available in a year or a year and a half that folks are working on now. So this toolkit hopefully will always be relevant, which is why it's housed on our website. It's just a set of web pages. It's not a downloadable PDF, intentionally so, right? So that no matter when you go and access it, you always see the latest version. It was very particular that the methods need to be accessible. So we start by talking about learning the language of carbon. If we don't speak a common language, we can't have a conversation about carbon. And having conversations is where change starts. And then this is my favorite bit. The toolkit has plenty of practical stuff on like, this is what you should do to screen products, this is what you should do to like, to change your practice around this or that, how do you hold, charrettes with your team and so on and so forth. There's lots of stuff in there. But this is actually my favorite bit because ultimately we're gonna have to change mindsets. Right? We have to think differently about materials. One of my favorite strategies that the toolkit suggests is considering permanence and temporariness when you design a space. What aspects of the space are permanent, really permanent, and what aspects of the space are temporary? And therefore, what materials should you use, what products should you use in something that is temporary versus what you should use when it's permanent? And then the last piece is looking to the future, thinking about materials as a carbon solution rather than a carbon problem. Because eventually we're going to have to move towards bio-based materials, we're going to have to move towards carbon capture, because we have, as I said right at the beginning, a historical wrong to correct. But we're still a little bit away from that, although I just saw a whole bunch of bio-based carpet backing at NeoCon. So, we're making progress. The other thing that works with the toolkit is something that Ellen mentioned in her remarks. Just this week, we launched the Interior Design Pledge for Positive Impact, which is the first time that all three professional associations in North America, ASID, IIDA, and the Interior Designers of Canada, have come together to say this is our common understanding of what sustainability means in interior design. So we have a basic framework. It is a very ambitious framework. There's many parts of the framework that we have no idea how to accomplish today. But that's what pledges are. It's no point making a commitment to something you know that you can comfortably accomplish. The whole point of a pledge or a commitment is to commit to things that challenge you and then move you forward. So the Interior Design Pledge is an ambitious framework, and it asks for 3 interconnected commitments, as Ellen said, around climate, health, and equity. It acknowledges that those 3 things are connected. And in light of what I just told you about carbon footprints, here's something to consider. Acoustic panels, for instance, have a very high carbon footprint. Okay? And yet, are you going to put people in a space and give them no acoustic comfort? So what do? Choosing the lowest carbon options means no acoustic materials in a space. So how are you going to work your way out of that one? So we have to understand trade-offs. We have to set priorities on projects. We have to set carbon budgets on projects. We have to make sure that we understand our goals for every project. The toolkit helps you do that too. But in doing so, we can address climate, health, and equity not as competing sort of interests, but try and find those places where they intersect. So those are the 2 pieces that I have to offer you as of today. The Climate Toolkit for Interior Design and the Interior Design Pledge for Positive Impact, but there's much more coming. We have to build more resources. We have a lot of catching up to do in our industry. So I hope all of you will take the pledge. I hope all of you will take a look at the toolkit. I hope you will tell us where we are going wrong, what we are missing, because we desperately need that. we need all of you to apply your considerable expertise and intellect to the problem at hand, and to get your students to do so too. We need we need an army working on this, and you have an army. So let's get to it. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic.
Thanks so much.
So scribbled a lot of notes. The first thing I'll offer is, you're a magazine, you're a journalist. This is what you've laid out here with the toolkit is a credible example of what's increasingly called solutions journalism. Journalists tend to report on what's happening or happened. Sometimes when I was in the New York Times, editors gave us the flexibility to report on something that might happen, like climate change. 30 years ago when I was writing about this for Discover magazine, it was mostly projections, and we don't write about the future very well. And we also don't focus much on solutions. So bravo for that, for one thing, that toolkit. And also making it online so it's not stuck in time. Brilliant innovation as well.
So this is why I'm a little like starstruck talking to you. I mean that is. Here's the thing. You're absolutely right, and this is not traditionally journalism. I don't even know if the toolkit is journalism at all in a way. There's two problems, and I'm sure you appreciate this because you've seen it over and over in sector after sector after sector. We came upon it, my predecessors at Metropolis came upon it for the architectural profession, and I am now dealing with the same problem with the interiors profession, is that we're reporting with directional numbers, right? Like, we're talking about projections, but even the projections, and I can be really honest because this is an academic community here, and we care about rigor and truth as we do in journalism. Even the projections have yet to be verified, right? We know that, I know directionally that what I'm saying is true because it makes sense, it adds up. We see these processes at work. And yet, when I stand up and say, which is why I always offer a caveat, when I stand up and say 1/10 of the world's carbon emissions by 2050, can I verify that to be true? Right now I can't, because I don't know how to say it, we don't even know how to include interiors within a life cycle assessment of a building.
Yeah, this gets at a very important phenomenon I've seen in a bunch of sectors, which is we all want a number. This includes, when I was working in the National Geographic Society, when it was on the grant-making side, it's all about measurable, verifiable. There's I forgot the acronym. They want measurement and impact evaluation, which are a bad fit for problems that have where you have the urgency of knowing you have to get going. And you don't really know often the direction that's the best direction. You know kind of general sense of where you want to go. And that seems to be a tough reality in every sector. LEED, what I understand, originally left out energy. So we don't want to have an hour on LEED, the LEED. Let me just take this to a key thing here. One, you mentioned mindset and you mentioned materials as two fundamental parts of this challenge. To me, the bigger one seems to be mindset.
Yeah.
Does that fit? And that's that's not very easy to measure. Materials we know how to measure.
Yeah, and of course mindsets influence how we use materials.
Right.
I mean, they're nested problems. David spoke about reuse and renovation. We're not exceptional in the interior design industry. Many other industries that live on cultural cycles, thrive off of that, have the same problem like fashion does. Like, we're obsessed with the new. We want the new. And the mindset change that we need is, how do we think about time differently? And this was, and that's a bit of it's a time problem. Like, we don't think about life cycles correctly, or realistically, we sometimes get caught up in thinking about the life cycle that we would like to have for our projects versus the ones that they're likely going to have. And so I want people to be aspirational, yet we know the reality of how the industry works today. So unless there's credible proof that the industry is changing, we probably shouldn't change our expectations of life cycles on our projects, right? So that's why the mindset shift is tough, is because either we don't want to change our mindsets, or please forgive me, like I'm not being cynical, but like we're overly aspirational. Like I internally lost my temper when the designer said, I didn't show it because I was trying to be nice, but when the designer said that, oh, like a Saarinen table, I hope this chair will last forever. And I thought of a zillion bitchy things I could say to that. Right? Like, how do we change that mindset? How do we be pragmatic and yet hopeful?
It seems to be an open question everywhere. I interviewed Tom Cridland, who's a designer. He created the 30-year sweatshirt. And, there's all kinds of questions. First, 9 million people are not going to buy the 30-year sweatshirt and still have an industry. And at the same time, there are timeless aspects to things. Maybe there is a sweatshirt. I probably have a sweatshirt that's lasted 30 years. But it does feel like it's idealistic.
Yeah.
And not part of the reality. But
so a couple of things. I think it's idealistic because, not because it's a wrong thing to hope for. It's idealistic because we're not simultaneously working on the structures that will help that happen. So at Neocon, again, some good news. So typically for workplace projects, and again, we don't have the Carbon Leadership Forum, which currently has been doing most of the research. The few studies they've done are on workplace projects. Okay, it actually all started with WeWork. That's where some of the data started. Much as you may have the experience about WeWork, really that's at the kernel of all of this actually. In workplace projects, the top few hotspots are flooring, walls and ceiling, and furniture. Now for flooring and walls and ceilings, we have, luckily, because they're also, they have crossover with architecture. When tools were being built for the construction industry or the architecture industry, those materials were included. So we have baselines for those. They're included in the embodied carbon and construction calculator, which is a fantastic tool to use. So there's some support there. Furniture, which is one of the largest volume products that interior designers deal with, we have none of that. Even though furniture companies, Herman Miller, Steelcase, like these companies were, founding partners of LEED, have been working on their manufacturing processes for years. They have so much data available and all of that stuff. Even so, we don't know, right? Forgot what I was saying. So I get on my soapbox and so that's the problem, right? It's so then you see life cycle. So we don't even know how to include interior renovations in life cycle assessments. I just met, I think, one of the firms that was part of our toolkit is MSR Design out of Minneapolis, and I bring them up because they're not only doing a lot of work, as many firms are, but they're actually making their tools available for free online on their site for any other firm to use. So I really urge you to go to msrdesign.com/generative impacts. I said it so many times now, I know it off the top of my head, and go and check it out, because one of the things they did, and sorry, Andy, give me just a second. One of the things they did is they're working on multifamily projects. They're using Tally, which is a life cycle assessment tool that you use to calculate carbon footprints. And they realized that even though Tally allows you to put in numbers for countertops, it actually doesn't include countertops in the final calculation of carbon footprint. So what do you do? So this amazing designer, Emily Gross, she tricked Tally by pretending that her countertops were floors, because it does count floors, and then she output the number, then she divided that per square foot, and then added that number into whatever final result was. Imagine having to do this for every single product category in interiors. Like, it tires me even thinking about it. But that's because I'm imagining one person doing it. Like, what if, like, every BFA class or MFA class had a couple of students who wanted to do that for a category? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not saying you should run this industry on the free labor of students, please don't get me wrong. Get them grants, please get them grants. But, you know, I think we need the space. And then that's the other problem, is that, you know, designers have to do all this research, but they have to firms have to fund this all themselves, right? I had somebody from Amazon at an event we did at NearCon where I gave a very similar presentation, and she said, well, what is a tool that I can just give my design teams, the designers I hire, and tell them to just use it? And I was like, no such tool exists. So I have to ask you, are you willing to pay your designers, if you really care about bringing in the carbon footprint to your projects, are you willing to pay your designers to actually do the research while they're on their project, right? Was that a yes or no? I put her on the spot, and that was not fair. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's the other problem, is it takes time. We don't have the, time is money, we don't have the money to pay for the time that we need to do this stuff. So again, I'm sure all industries have gone through these pains, but we're just at our start here.
Yeah. Do you have a rough sense of how much, when you look at the embodied carbon aspect of a typical office, how much of that is energy, specifically energy, as opposed to other aspects of materials? Is it basically most of it, the energy that was required, presumably was fossil fuel energy?
Yeah, most of it. Energy manufacturing.
Well, this gets to, like, a lot of this could go away, at least the climate aspects, not the equity and other health and environmental impacts, if you have a clean energy system. In other words,
if all our manufacturing was
well, I had the good fortune once, 2016, I sat with Bill Gates in Seattle for about 45 minutes, and I thought I had him pinned at one point. I said, like, New York's, actually, I specifically said, there's a video of this. I found out recently, I said, Bill, New York City has 1 million buildings, and which the fact that still blows my mind, and that Mayor Bloomberg, 2013, they did an assessment that basically said 85% of the buildings in 2050 still exist now, which is your whole arena, right? And I said to him, that seems like so monumentally hard, and you know, the scale of this city, how does that happen? And like a second and a half went by, and he said, well, but like he does, if all the energy coming into your energy system is zero carbon, then the city can be a leaky bucket and it doesn't really matter anymore. Which is an interesting perspective. He kind of like, got it.
I hate to tell you, yes and no. So yes, notionally that's true. But when you talk about, this is why embodied carbon is such a like headspin, and that's why most companies, even all the ones, I mean, Amazon climate pledge, they're going to get to carbon neutral 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement, blah blah blah. They're only now looking at scope 3 emissions, right? Scope 3 is where embodied carbon sits. The problem with that is, how many layers deep can you go in your supply chain for clean energy? Because your factory making chairs runs on clean energy, but you're assembling that factory. What about the factory that's making the parts?
Sure.
What about the factory that's making the raw materials that makes those parts? Right? So we have to get really deep with clean energy before we can say, oh, if all of the United States is on clean energy, then we still wouldn't have erased our carbon debt. Right? So yes, true, but also not true.
For sure, I know. And he knows that too.
I know.
But he had a book, anyway, everyone has a position on this. And I guess this gets me to this thing about the education component here. You know, I'm at Columbia University. Much of what I do there is trying to facilitate crosstalk among disciplines that historically never have talked to each other. And I'm sure in architecture and design, are the psychologists on campus, the behavioral scientists, the data scientists talking to folks in manufacturing and in behavior change as it relates to the consumer, the folks who are renting these spaces and want them new. So how much of the challenge is in getting more expertise or perspectives talking to each other that aren't in the room right now? Like, who is into the room?
I think you're absolutely right. That's a big part of the challenge. There are some things we're not equipped in the industry to handle the science ourselves. So there's a lot of science that we need to bring in as you've been doing. That you've seen that in every industry. And then not just on climate, but on a lot of other things as well. When we talk about material chemistries and whatever, I've heard it at least pre-pandemic when I was going around to people's offices and actually meeting people, heard it maybe 6-7 times in a year, the exact same phrasing, which is, I'm not a chemist. Okay? It always, and I'm sure all of you have taught it at some point, it comes up all the time. There's definitely, I think, on certain parts of this, I think the door has been opened for one of our recent obsessions before the pandemic was neuroscience, neuroaesthetics. I'm sure all of you have seen it somewhere, touched upon it somewhere. This whole thing, how our brain works and all of that. There's a concept we especially love in interior design called biophilia, which definitely needs more science and more humanities. That's the other thing. Part of this is that when we think of expertise, we typically think of the hard sciences. I would stick there, but my training is in the humanities. And I think both of us have that in common. We believe that the humanities have a role to play in this, and I think there's less of an understanding of what kinds of expertise we want to learn. Yet, at the bottom of this, as you're saying, it's a behavioral question. It's also a cultural question, and I think the material science is only going to get us so far, right? We have to take the right decisions. We have to take them for the right reasons. Those practices have to become self-sustaining in some way, which means that they have to feel good and affirming to us in our lives. Otherwise, we're never going to kind of adopt them. And so, so I would say, the scientists, but then everybody else. I think you're right that we need to be talking to behavioralists. We need to be talking to, behavioral economics is such a thing anyway. So there's a lot that we need to do.
Well, and this implies that this is just the beginning of a conversation in this arena, and there's so much crosstalk. I did a session at the Landscape Architects big meeting, the last big meeting in San Diego, and a lot of the same concepts and questions were being on the floor there too. Partially because I got to know Ian McHarg, who was this landscape designer, who he was all about knowing this sort of the hydrology, the geology, and the human cultural history of a place before you got into telling someone what they might do with it. That feels like very similar to the conversation that must have to happen with the customer and the designer and everyone else in this industry too. A lot more listening.
Ian McHarg, hero. Absolutely. And there are firms that are, the grass is always greener on the other side. I talk to landscape architects as well, and sometimes I'm like, I wish interior designers had the tools at hand that landscape architects have. Now, landscape architecture, they've developed their first tools around carbon recently. Pathfinder has been around for a few years. It's fantastic. It's amazing. Shout out to them. We just gave them an award and are on positive awards. Because, in many ways, landscape architecture is a solution also to our climate problem. They deal with soil, they deal with plants, they deal with water. They deal with the things that are going to sequester carbon. Right? They don't know yet. They have other problems. We published a piece recently saying that landscape architecture has a labor acknowledgement problem. So yes, landscape architects design all these things, and then immigrant labor with very few benefits actually create the landscapes. So everybody has their cross to bear. Their cross is not our cross is not their cross. Everybody has their cross to bear. But Ian McCart's methodology is phenomenal, and there are firms who work that way in landscape architecture today, still today. Nelson Berg Watts is one firm that comes to mind, but there are many others who do that, look at deep history. And in interior design, I hate to say this, our history is not that deep. Like you got to figure out what happened 10 years ago in your space, or 5 years ago in your space. But how do you do that if that history's been erased by somebody before you get to it, right? And part of the thing is, how are you going to make sure that the history of what you've done today is not erased? So there's a lot of things in the toolkit about documenting projects at closeout. Like, we need new tools for that. Chain of custody. Like, okay, like it was erased, don't be part of the problem. How are you going to transfer over the information of what you're working on to the next interior designer who comes to Justice Space?
That's great. Well, thank you so much for the time you spent here. And I think the thanks to the school and everyone else for putting on this symposium. It's going to be a great one. And there are questions. Yeah.
Well, we're going to see if there are any questions.
Great. In the room here too, I assume.
You can applaud though for what you heard so far. I'm Barbara Wainwright. Thank you all for coming. And we thought we would open it up to questions from the audience, if you have any. And we're going to do this in a low-tech way, which is that you're going to raise your hand, you're going to say the question, they're going to repeat it. Okay? Does anyone have any questions for Avi or for Andrew? Oh, come on. So I think the question about cross-disciplinary, cross-fertilization is a really important one. Usually in design industries, you tend to remain siloed a little bit in what you know and what you do. What kind of suggestions do you have for how we might extend to other disciplines and bring them into the conversation and work with them? You mentioned that at Columbia, there are all these, constituencies. When do they come in the same room, and when do they work together? Even the material scientists or the sociologists or whatever. What do you suggest?
Usually there has to be an incentive to foster the cross-talk. The National Science Foundation has a new line of grants that are, convergence is a word that you hear increasingly. So if there's funding, even a company can stimulate that kind of crosstalk with leadership that says, we're going to give extra time to people to reach out of your cubbyhole to others. Sometimes it requires just a lot of listening and poking, having someone who's a professional poker. Kind of part of my job, the internal part of my job at Columbia is I see it as running around the campus, virtually or otherwise, and saying, wow, there's a sociologist here who studies expertise. Gil Ayal, he's written the book on expertise, literally, like when it gets ignored and when it doesn't. And he needs to be in the room with the energy people who are trying to create energy policy that has scientists being a trusted source in the room. And they don't even know each other. So someone hopefully is looking at this with that approach.
Yeah.
And getting universities or specialized schools like this one, or in a city that's full of other institutions. So this kind of cross-fertilization through conferences would like to be part of that too.
Yeah, I think for students it's very valuable actually to bring different voices in that aren't necessarily the voices they're used to listening to. You've done that a bit with Metropolis, where I think you've brought in people who aren't, within that narrow scope of interior design or architecture. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's proved really useful as a tactic. Although I will say we didn't go very far. We could probably go farther than we have. But it seemed to me that even sustainability leaders at manufacturing companies weren't talking to sustainability leaders at architecture and design firms. So like CSO to CSO conversations weren't happening. So I'm not even, like, we haven't done anything at the scale that we are talking about, Andy, and we need to do that. As a magazine in general, like, we've tried to do that a bit. We've had behavioral economists, we've had mathematicians, we have all kinds of people who contribute to the magazine over the years. And we should be doing more of that. We're hoping to do more next year. I have some plans about that. But we have, yeah, you're right. How do we listen to, how do we listen to sociologists? How do we listen to, other professionals? So we've done it in a limited way, however, like, just to be fair. And yet, even that limited interaction, I think, isn't happening as much as it should be. So, for instance, for the hackathon, you saw all the groups that were part of, all the kind of profiles that were part of it. Folks from commercial real estate, folks from what for interior designers we call clients, but they're actually just companies in the world, Facebook, Ford, and LinkedIn. And sustainability leadership at all of those places weren't even talking to each other. Forget about like cross-disciplinary kind of collaboration. So sometimes even like finding that kind of vertical connection across sort of industries, like, oh, I'm Grand Cuba at my company, you're Grand Cuba at your company, we should be talking. We have the same title and our work connects, yet we're not talking to each other, right? So, yeah, that needs to happen.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the possibilities you see for using a circularity framework?
Repeat the question.
Circularity framework, is that useful?
Yeah. It's the only solution, honestly. I don't know of any other framework that can successfully address the climate crisis. Even in our pledge, in an early draft, the Design for Climate commitment was called Design for Circularity. I got vetoed on that for good reasons. But it is the only solution because we're used to in our industry considering materials and how materials move in the world, and material flows in the world, and the only way to kind of not only negate negative impacts, but also to have enough negation of negative impacts. I can't believe I said that. In order to allow natural systems to regenerate. So if we keep pumping affluents into our water systems, we know all the bad things that happen. But how long do we need to stop the pumping in order for those water systems to regenerate, right? So unless we keep the waste, waste becomes raw material and so on and so forth, which is the principle of the circular economy, there's no chance for natural systems to regenerate. So that's the ultimate goal. But Andy definitely has written and researched far more on the circular economy. And he's like,
well, to me, the ultimate challenge here still feels like it's about how people, whether it's the client or the designer or the manufacturers, how they perceive this space called a room or an office or a building. And you were saying earlier, I love that idea of keeping track of the story of the room, its history and its future. So you're playing a part, and it makes it more like tenancy. It reminds me of a Brown University. Sears Jane, a professor of comparative literature, taught me about in Italian. Some word in Italian. You don't own the land. You live on the land. You're holding the land, and if you're holding the space, even as a tenant, that feels like a way to change the story potentially. I think circularity will always be a secondary component until we find some ways to do that bigger thing.
Yeah.
So, sorry, it's all about the narrative actually, so as you were saying, Avi, I'm sorry, I'm talking to the back of the room. understanding the history of your interior, being able to write that history yourself, or understanding the narrative of why this is important. I mean, I think a lot of what students need to know is, how also to talk to their clients about why these things are important. And designers tend to be generalists anyway, right? You have to know a little bit about a lot of things. So it gets overwhelming sometimes. Do I now have to be an economist, and I have to be a material scientist, and I have to be, all these things. But I think that if you can get the narrative right as a designer and you're pitching your idea, then that's a large part of that. I think we can take one more question. Yes.
What do you think that the profession, the academy, and journalism can do to communicate what we've learned about tonight across the very sharp political divide that exists in the country?
Can you repeat the question?
What can journalism, the academy, and this profession, this set of practices do to convey these ideas in a way that doesn't run into the roadblock of polarization or political divides we have?
I feel like you need to take that first.
Well, I think it's actually an arena where you can get some of that, because conservatives, true conservatives, they just don't want to be told what to do. But if they have options or a sense of legacy, there are many conservative people I know who have a strong sense of legacy and responsibility and quality, and whether it's a piece of furniture or other aspects of their lives. So I think this is an arena. If you take away the climate, if you can normalize the decarbonization and take away this climate, this sort of imperative part of it, you should have a lot of this can work pretty smoothly. If you make it about the climate crisis, as opposed to longevity, prosperity, thriving, regenerative qualities, resilience, health, you won't hit those roadblocks.
The other thing that, I don't know, I hope this is true, I say it all the time, but I don't think we can expect people to do the right thing and also say you should only do the right things for the right reasons, and the right reasons are the reasons that I believe in. Right? Like, honestly, I've come to think that I don't care why somebody does the right thing as long as they do it. And that was part of our thinking with this toolkit, especially the work with clients section in the toolkit, which is pretty careful about saying, when we talk about the climate crisis, to point to general trends in society as to why people care about the climate crisis. But then also to say that any decisions that you take towards decarbonization also have these other benefits. Okay? And I've heard this from leaders in sustainability at Perkins & Will, which is supporting today's conference, from other large, not just national but international firms who are dealing with not just the political divide in the United States, which we're so used to thinking of the political divide as being Republican versus Democrat in this country. But actually, the political divides are many and multifarious across the world. And any building project, I want to just remind everyone, is a global endeavor. Most of the stuff in buildings doesn't come just from the United States. It comes from all over the world, which means that our projects are implicated in global political systems, not the US political system. So that's another thing that we have to understand. Anyway, and like, in India we have this saying, like, with every 4 miles the air and water changes, right? Like, what you believe to be right and true for the right and true reasons cross the border and it looks completely different, right? And so we have to keep that in mind, as you're saying, Andy. It's like, you suddenly find that people have their own reasons for caring about the same things, except, so as long as you don't demand that they care about them only for the reasons that you care about them, we have a chance. And I say this as like a millennial and a brown person, and a queer person, and I strongly believe in, the the queering of spaces and discourse and all of that. But that is what it is, because part of how we understand queerness is making room for different ways of seeing the world, and we sometimes lose sight of that. But that is what is at the heart of queerness. And I think, and I say this because our profession, the interior design profession, it's still true, full of women and queer people. Like, if we don't hold space for these things, like, what profession is going to? Like, architecture with all their white men? Like, excuse me? I love architecture. Metropolis is also an architecture magazine. I'm not here to diss architecture. They know they have that problem. But we don't. So what's stopping us?
Okay. All right. There you have it. Okay, so thank you so much, Avi and Andy, for joining us tonight and for sharing. I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening. Join us tomorrow, where we will be virtual until the end of the afternoon, but we will be having a keynote by Jennifer Graham of Perkins and Will. We will have presentations on green school design based on indigenous principles, also green hotel design, as well as speed presentations by teachers who have innovative teaching ideas about teaching sustainability. And we will also have a student panel because we really want to listen to the students and what they have to say. And in addition to that, at the end of the day, tomorrow we'll have another live stream keynote with Eric Corey-Free talking about new frontiers in interior design. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow.